Good morning, everyone. Please make sure that if you're joining us for this session that your mic has been muted and your webcam has been selected to off. And we're going to go ahead and get started. We're super excited that we have Maria Garai-Tunandia as our keynote this morning. She will be doing a series of 3 separate sessions, today being the first. Her focus will be on gender today. Thursday, the focus will be on ethnic and national intercultural topics, and then Friday will be generational topics. So she has experience in global leadership development through training and coaching. She has over 20 years of business and senior management experience with clients in the United States and Latin America, as well as experience as an expat entrepreneur establishing her own consulting firm in Mexico. She offers a variety of things dealing with cross-cultural training and coaching for expats and families, team management globally, diversity and inclusion, and leadership and business competencies. She was certified in Singapore and provided excellent services for training to over 1,000 employees at Nokia from 2009 to 2011. So we're very excited to have her today, and we're going to go ahead and get her started. She will also have a Q&A session at the end. So go ahead, Maria, and start your keynote.
Thank you, Andy. And by the way, everybody, I have forwarded some resources and bibliography to Andy, which I'm sure she'll be making available to all of you, as well as the PowerPoints. I'll be sending those as well, so you can have some reference material if you find these topics interesting. So, so hopefully, and by the way, she's going to be helping me taking a look at, if anybody has questions or comments that you want to write in the chat, feel free, and she will be helping me out. I'll be pausing here and again so that we can maybe touch on a few of those. I know that there's probably going to be a whole lot of different comments and questions, but we'll try to get a few of them at least. So hopefully we can cover all of your doubts or questions that you might have. So just wanted to get those little domestics out of the way. So anyhow, I'm Maria Garai-Tunandia, and kudos to Andy for tackling that hard last name. Everybody's a little intimidated by it. It's actually from the north of Spain, Basque country, and between France and Spain. My grandfather was an immigrant who left that area and settled in Cuba back in the beginning of the last century. And a little bit about myself. I'm American, first generation American born. My parents are Cuban. When I was growing up, we lived in a few different countries because my dad got transferred there with the company he was with, and we lived abroad for about 10 years when I was a kid, and then I lived another 20 abroad. So now I live in Miami. I'm originally from Philadelphia, but I live in Miami now. And right now during COVID, I decided to quarantine in Mexico because I got a place here. So I'm talking to you from Mexico right now. I figured, what the heck, might as well be in a place where you enjoy yourself. So anyway, so that's where I am right now. Now, since most of my life, I've kind of been an outsider looking in from all the different places that I've had to live. As a kid, I kind of learned how to observe and imitate others. Being a kid sometimes is kind of tough, and you don't want to, you don't want to be the outsider. You don't like to be excluded. So you kind of learn. You kind of learn to look and observe and become more situational. I think kids are a lot more adaptable than we are as adults, and there's a lot to be said about learning from that versatility that children have. So obviously, communication and cross-cultural issues are near and dear to me because I've lived them in my own flesh and blood, right? And my aim today is to touch upon a few of the things that can cause and cause misunderstandings. And I want to see if I can help you understand some of the whys, the underlying whys, to help you kind of be able to process it better and successfully bridge any kind of differences that you face, especially in a work environment. Okay, so how am I going to do that? As Andrea said, I picked 3 topics because I mean this can be a huge topic that we can spend days on. But I picked a few of them I took the one that has to do with gender because I think it's something that we all kind of struggle with now and again. I thought we would talk a little bit about national and ethnic culture, okay, which is what we usually think about when we think about intercultural issues. And then the last one is going to be on generational culture, because we now even have language for generational cultures as well. So that's my idea, okay? There's so many different topics that we can talk about when we talk about culture, but those are the ones I want to focus on. Okay, so when we talk about culture, what is culture anyway? And I'd love for you here, take a couple seconds and in the chat, and I'm going to let Andy see what you're writing. So how would you describe culture? What is culture to you? Okay, what do you understand when you hear the word culture? What is it? And I'll give you a couple of seconds, and Andy, tell me what you see, if you see what some of the answers are.
Hi, Maria. We do have a participant that's typed in your system of beliefs.
System of beliefs. Okay, that's excellent. Anybody else want to kind of like add to that? Besides the system of beliefs, what else have we got? What else do you think about when you think of culture? How do you define it? And how do you know what your culture is?
Another participant has typed in different nationalities working together at one place. And also another participant has indicated experiences that influence how you view everything around you.
Oh, okay, the experiences that kind of give you a perspective. Okay.
Population habits.
Okay. 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 These are great. They all fall into what we understand as culture. Now, the definition I really like the most is one by this guy named Geert Hofstede, who's a famous interculturalist. He's kind of considered the father of intercultural studies. He's Dutch, and I like the way that he puts it. It's basically culture is that collective programming that distinguishes one group of people from another. And it makes a lot of sense. It's something that you learn and you share. It's not something that you're born with. You have to learn it. And other people have to kind of reinforce it, okay? So you can see how it's not only nationalities. When we look at this definition, we can see how we have all different types of cultures, whether we're talking about gender, you know, of one group versus another group, men versus women. We can talk about, of course, race. We can talk about countries. We can talk about regions. We can talk about generations. We can talk about industry. I mean, there's probably a steel industry culture or manufacturing culture. You might have class culture. There's so many different things. If you think about it, it's basically, you can see how you are a member of many different subcultures, almost like an onion, where you can kind of peel back all of the layers, right? So if we think about this, and keep this in mind as we go forward, especially in the 3 days that we're going to be talking about different topics, you can kind of see how culture, if you compare it to an iceberg, you can see how there's certain observable elements about culture, which obviously culture usually drives our behavior, because culture gives us our values. It's what we learn maybe first from our parents, and it gets reinforced at school, with our neighbors, with our community, with our society, okay? But there's certain things that we can see very obvious that are very tangible, like those things that you can gauge with your five senses. So, for example, if any of you have gone to a different country or are in a different country currently, the first things that kind of pop out at you are things that you can, you know, hear, smell, touch, taste, see, okay? Food, language, people's accents, you know, even if you go from the north to the south, south to the west, you can hear people's different accents, okay? The way they use certain words. General protocol, how people greet each other, what the infrastructure is like, okay? And then, of course, we've got the things that are underneath the surface, which are not quite so obvious. It takes us a little longer to understand them. And that has to do with our beliefs and attitudes, things that we've learned. How do you raise a kid? You know, are you more structured with the kid, or do you spoil them? How do you communicate with people? Are you more direct or indirect? What's the rules as far as friendship and family? You know, and of course today, well, during these 3 days, I want to talk specifically about communication, because all of the things that we learn, especially on the bottom part of that iceberg, are the things that are going to affect the way that we communicate with each other. Okay, so we'll look a little bit more detail of some of these things that are underneath the surface on Thursday when we talk about some of the intercultural stuff. Okay, so that said, and understanding that culture is something that we share and we learn, obviously we're going to see how that's going to cause these different filters in front of our face. So you know, all of the things that I value, the things that drive my behavior, the things that have been reinforced by my family as I was growing up and by my community, is kind of how we see life. We think we're really objective, but we're not. We're very subjective beings. And whatever we hold dear or we value is basically what becomes our filter of what should be. Okay? So that said, obviously, we don't really realize we have these lenses on until we're faced with patterns of behavior that we find strange or illogical or wrong from our perspective. Why? Because we've learned, for example, if growing up as a kid, I was told, you know, you have to chew with your mouth closed, or don't interrupt when people are speaking, I learned that that's what's valued. That's the way that I have to do things. So that if I run into somebody who happens to chew with their mouth open, or somebody who happens to interrupt me, I will understand that to me, that's wrong. Okay? So it's really important to realize that it's just our default. It's not, you know, we don't realize that we're, you know, that what the way we see things is a subjective way. And if we jump to value judgments because we see somebody doing something that seems illogical or incorrect, we might jump to judge them, but we don't realize that we might be being judged as well, because they might see us just as strange as we see them. Okay, now going forward, I'm going to be speaking in generalizations, which is different from stereotyping. Okay, when we talk in generalization, it's kind of trying to find loose patterns by observation. You kind of try to acknowledge that different patterns exist that might be complex and changing, and you have to be open to the fact that the patterns can change. Whereas when you stereotype, you're painting with a broad brush and you're applying things to everybody. Okay, so we have to be careful, and we have to understand that when we make generalizations, whether it's about gender or whether it's about, you know, national culture or race or regions or generations, that people are not always going to fit into these nice, neat archetypes. Okay, but anyhow, okay, so let's start. Let's start when we talk about gender. Okay, we've said that culture is learned and shared. Okay, so let's start from the time when we start learning certain patterns about our gender. Okay, so usually, and by the way, a lot of this information that I'm giving you is based on sociological and neuro-linguistic studies by the women who are considered kind of the mothers of cross-gender communication, which are Deborah Tannen and Dr. Phyllis Mindel from Georgetown University. They're kind of like the founding mothers, and they have a bunch of books. I've included that in the resource guide, so you can kind of read them. They're fun and interesting, and kind of they shed a lot of light on some of the things that sometimes we don't realize we take for granted. Okay, so from the very time we're kids, we start seeing rules forming. Okay, we have to start learning the rules of the game. It can be kind of tricky, and by the way, the way that gender roles have been, you know, are given, they've been changing throughout the years, because we can also attribute the way the kids play has changed a lot too. Okay, I think I read an article on how a lot of the, well, I don't know Toys R Us and a few different toy companies have gone out of business, a lot of it, yes, part of it can be attributed to large retailers like Amazon and so forth. But another thing is that with the advent of digitalization, you're finding that children are skewing younger in the toys with which they play. So if maybe 30, 40 years ago, girls were playing with dolls or Barbies until they were 11 or 12, girls are only playing with Barbies or dolls now until maybe age 6 or 7. And if that, because now everybody has a tablet or an iPad or something. So that's another thing that can change culture as well, by the way. Culture is dynamic. So anyway, sorry, I'm going back. Let me go back to this, okay? So when we talk about kids, when kids are little, you can see that little girls usually play in smaller groups, okay? 2 or 3 girls at a time. And usually the games are highly participative, consensus type games, a lot of role play. Okay, as you can see, these 2 little girls, you've got, you got your doctor and your patient. Okay, and they have to set the ground rules. They have to reach a consensus as to who's going to get to be the doctor and who's going to be the patient. Okay, now it's no surprise in this picture that our older girl gets to be the doctor, which is maybe a more fun role to play, and the younger girl, it has to play the patient. But again, she doesn't have to. If she doesn't like it or she doesn't think it's fair, she can walk away. So you'll see that usually little girls have to learn how to be diplomatic. They have to learn how to maybe persuade the other little girl or girls. So the alpha female can't just be the boss of everybody else, because the other girls will rebel. They'll be like, "You're not the boss of me," right? So alpha girl has to be smart. She has to convince the other girls to go along with what she wants. She has to get consensus. She has to be liked, and maybe ask. And if in worst case scenario, compromise and take turns. Okay, that's the only way that the game will be able to continue. Otherwise, there's no game. Okay. Now, since this mode depends a lot on words, you'll see that little girls have to develop a lot of communicating skills. You'll find that friendship is usually developed through sharing thoughts and talking, and little girls talk a lot to each other. Okay. Okay. So keep this in mind. Now let's go to the little boys. How do little boys usually play? Well, they usually play in larger groups, and it's usually more about competitive games and trying to reach a certain goal. It's okay to stand out and show off. It's actually good because it's part of the competitiveness. It's okay to demand or challenge, and there's a natural hierarchy among boys that is accepted. It's accepted as normal. So if you're the star athlete or you're the owner of the basketball, you might have a certain status, and the other boys will accept that. They won't be like, "You're not the boss of me." It's kind of like either you align or you just stay. You want to go home, it's no problem. Next day is another day, right? And usually the friendships, the boys will develop a friendship by doing things together. You won't find a lot of, I don't want to be the center. I want to be this, the small forward. Okay, well, let's take turns. No, it's usually you get to do this. You're going to be this. You're going to be the point guard or whatever, and you're going to be this, and you're going to be that. If you don't want to, you can just go home. And it might be up to the alpha male to make those decisions. Okay, so keep this in mind, because even though it might seem like something silly and you never really thought about it, it's how we're learning. We're starting to learn and share certain ways of doing things. Okay, so what happens and how does this impact the way we perceive communication? Well, it's kind of interesting, because as we grow into adulthood, we've learned that the purpose of communication is for different things. Okay, so whereas for men, maybe they've learned that communication serves a very pragmatic, practical purpose. For women, communication might help me develop connections and maintain relationships. So we've got the guys on the one hand, as little boys, they've been learning, how to speak in a way that helps them maintain their independence, helps them compete, helps them solve problems. It's a very pragmatic way of thinking about communication, solving and doing, okay? On the other hand, for women, communication serves to kind of connect, to kind of develop a relationship, to understand somebody at a more intimate level, at a deeper level, to create empathy, to find what I have in common, okay? And it's usually no surprise that when we look at how men share information, men might share more information to show what they know, to explain what they know, to teach something, whereas women tend to share information to build relationships. And men, usually when we talk about active listening, you'll find that the way that men listen, they'll be listening, thinking about how to solve problems, okay? And that's, whereas women listen to try to gain understanding of like somebody else's experience. That's usually why we see that, I don't know if any of you have heard of that book, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We really could be, because again, we're talking about we've learned the purpose of communication being totally different and managed in totally different ways, okay? And by the way, there's kind of like an unwritten rule among women, especially looking at this last one, how we listen to gain understanding of others' experiences. There's this unwritten rule among women, and it hinges on vulnerability and opening up, because the way that you develop trust many times, and I know Brene Brown has talked a lot about this, when you open up and reveal or are a little bit more vulnerable, it kind of produces an automatic effect of reciprocity. When you open, it's, you're kind of giving somebody your trust. And there's a certain expectation that somebody will give you that same trust in return. As a woman, I could tell you that I look back and as I analyze my friendships with other women, this unwritten rule is pretty strong. And I can think of a couple times in my own life that I've had, close friendships. I remember when my kids were young and the kids were growing up, there were a few of us that would get together periodically and we would socialize, okay? And, we would take turns talking about our daily lives, whether it was, complaining about our husbands or expressing our apprehensions about raising our kids, or even certain insecurities about our appearance. It was something that you could kind of share and open and kind of chuckle and laugh at yourself. And then your girlfriends, they would laugh and chuckle and kind of share their stuff too, right? But I remember there was one woman in our group, and she would never really share very much. She would just kind of have this enigmatic Mona Lisa smile. And, when we would ask her, hey, how about you? How does this go up down in your family? She kind of like, she would always, her answers were always very detached. And she was like, no, my kids are great. Oh, no, my husband's super considerate. Oh, no. So like, she would never kind of like let her guard down. She wouldn't even tell us her age, okay? Now to me, that's a little strange when you can't even tell your girlfriends how old you are. And we knew she was around our same age, but it was kind of like setting up this huge barrier. So of course, if I look back, I think, well, Gabby never really became a very close friend of mine, whereas the other women did, because I didn't feel like, she wasn't letting me in, And so I think that's one of the things that you can see, that listening and opening and revealing is very important in order to be able to build a relationship. Now, there's a very interesting article I read a couple of years ago, and I also shared that in the resource guide because I found this fascinating. They had interviewed some transgender people about, you know, what, and it was actually specifically transgendered men. And they're like, okay, do men really have it easier? And it was really interesting. There was one particular trans guy who was saying, you know, when I was a woman and somebody would ask me, hey, how you doing? I'd get into detail and I'd be kind of chatty and I'd share stuff. And then when I transitioned into a man and somebody would question, I'd start like sharing. It just didn't go over well. People were like, you know, like, I'm not interested. And he had to learn how to kind of like adopt certain behaviors, you know, and he said everything from being in a wedding picture and all the guys saying, you know, take a high school football pose. And he was like, I had no idea how to do that because I didn't grow up. I didn't learn the, you know, the female culture. I didn't learn it. I had to learn it as an adult. So it's very interesting to see how even our gender patterns are something that we learn. We don't realize it, but we learn it. So super interesting, right? Okay, so far, I'd love to pause for a second and maybe open it up. Maybe Andy, if there have been any comments that have come up or questions, maybe we can pause for a second and see what's going on and what people are thinking or any questions that people might have.
Okay, we'll leave it open for just a second.
Okay, questions or comments, anybody? Yeah. And it can be like, yes, I agree, or no, that's crazy. Anything you want to share. Any comments or questions, Andy?
Yeah, we do have a comment from one of our participants that reads, this difference in communication causes some difficulty when running into projects.
Oh, sure, of course, yes. And I'm gonna get a little bit more into that because again, it's kind of like you've got this filter, this lens, you know, and you might have a blue lens, you've got your blue glasses, and your colleague might have yellow glasses and you're just not seeing it the same way. And what you're hearing is not, you're interpreting it one way, and what he's hearing, he's interpreting it a different way. So it's so super important to understand that this comes from way back when we're little kids, and we have to just learn to kind of put that a different color filter in front of us so that instead of seeing everything just blue, I might be able to see it a little more green. And he might, instead of seeing it yellow, see it a little blue. Because if we understand a little bit of, like I said, the whys behind it, it makes it a lot easier to not take things personally or not get annoyed or frustrated because the other person has a different set of rules than you do. So you're trying to play the same card game, but maybe for him, the aces are the higher number, or maybe the diamonds are the trump, and for you, like, I don't know, the hearts are the trump. So those are just thinking about it in that way, it makes it a little easier to understand that we've got a little bit of a different set of rules. Any other question?
Another one was, I think it explains a lot when dealing with different genders to resolve conflicts.
Okay.
My cohorts are not fans of consensuses or compromise.
Okay.
Another comment, we have a few more. I feel that women are more open to vulnerability and men seem to be more hesitant. And let's see, another one. This explanation explains some of the day-to-day communication people have with each other, being it me with my daughter or with my son or other people with me at work, similar to the courses we went through in the past of what type of person not everyone is supporting and controlling. So he's finding some weight with that.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, I'm glad to hear a lot of these comments. And of course, it's things that we've probably we've experienced, you know, all the time. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. So if we look at like different comparative styles, and again, we're looking back to boys versus girls. Okay, remember how the boys are more comfortable with the natural hierarchy, whereas girls it can't stand to be bossed around. Okay, so the boys, well, the men now are going to be more comfortable giving and taking orders, whereas women tend to be more comfortable seeking input and making suggestions. Okay, like feeling like they're part of something, feeling included, feeling like you're touching base with somebody. Again, because go back, the games require agreement and consensus. Okay. We also have to think about how we, for example, when we do a little bit of storytelling, or we do analogies, or I don't know, or we tell somebody what's gone on. Men tend to usually use sports or political references, okay, whereas women tend to use personal references. We'll tell a story about ourselves, and again, this is like one of the participants says, women have practiced this their whole lives. They've shared their stories, because that's how we get along with our girlfriends. That's how we negotiate intimacy. That's how we feel close to people. Okay, so whereas a guy might use like a story. Maybe to elaborate on, I don't know, maybe a story of failure, but ultimately being able to prevail. A man might choose a story about a beloved sports figure, or maybe something from history, whereas women will make it their story. Kind of like me telling you the story about Gabby, right? So I'll kind of open up and think about how it impacted me personally, right? Then, of course, we've got the decision-making styles. Because men have learned to kind of like take charge and don't ask as much, it's more of an independent decision-making style. Whereas a woman will be more into like, hey, let's talk about this, and even if I'm the boss, let me. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the situational leadership style. Women tend to go into the high relationship styles a lot more. So it's whether it's a coaching style or a collaborating style, women tend to use that style a lot more. Okay. And then another thing is, for example, the way that we talk. Somebody talked about how conflict is managed among genders. Men will tend to be more comfortable with opposing something right away. No, you know what? Hey, I don't agree with that. That's not going to work. To speaking up, kind of like challenging. Okay. Whereas women, we usually have to prelude everything with, I'm really sorry. This is just my opinion. This might not be right. So sometimes we use like a ritual apology, again, because we're more relationship oriented. So even before we're opening our mouth, we're thinking about how it's going to impact the other person, because again, it's something that we've learned. We've learned to kind of be peacemakers and try to be careful that our friends will want to play with us or whatever, So it's something that we learn from a very early age. And then lastly, when we talk about report talking is, when a guy explains things, or he wants to, give you the facts or teach you something, whereas women tend to have more of what we call a rapport talk. Okay, it's the way that I'm trying to like maybe find out how much you know, so that if you don't know, that I can kind of bring you up to speed. It's a way of kind of leveling the playing field, so that we're all on the same page, so that we're kind of like socially connected, so you feel a sense of solidarity with me. Okay, now this last point is interesting, because many of you have probably heard of that term that's used like mansplaining. Okay, this basically, for women, it's annoying if a man makes a decision, doesn't consult us, and then comes back and gives us an explanation of how things are, because we feel like we're being patronized. Whereas men will be like, you know, what the heck, I don't need to touch base with you on everything. Let's just go ahead and make a decision. He might see a woman's more collaborative style as a little bit wishy-washy, and it kind of can't get down to the nitty-gritty, okay? And especially like, you know, if you make a statement and then you kind of make it like you're asking a question, kind of like you kind of like elevate your voice, you know, kind of at the end. And I know a lot of people do that. That can kind of sound like you're coming across as not being self-confident or not being sure of yourself. If you do use the ritual apology, like I think, I kind of guess, I feel, oh, you're gonna, for a man, it might be like, you're not sure, you don't know, you know, whereas for us, a guy who comes out and explains something, we're gonna be like, oh, he's patronizing me, he's mansplaining, you know. And again, these are patterns we've learned. We need to be a little bit more empathetic and less judgmental, because I truly believe that people in their heart, they're good. Their sole purpose in life isn't to patronize or annoy us or frustrate us. I think most people are doing the best they can, and we just kind of have to be patient and understanding that they're seeing things logically from their lens, whereas we're seeing our things logically from our end. So, okay. So I don't know, I think this is kind of important. So I'd love to hear if you have any comments about any of the things that I've just mentioned. I'm gonna let Andy take a look, if anybody. And by the way, you can be writing while I'm saying this, so that you can just go up and look at and see, you know, your reactions as we're talking about some of these things. It's totally okay. So I'll give a couple seconds for that. Any comments there, Andy?
Yes, we have a few coming in. One comment is the ritual apology is taught to girls by their examples.
Yes.
Another comment is, sadly, when a woman crosses over to a man's perspective, she's a bad word. And when a man crosses over to a woman's to a woman's perspective, he's put down. Listening is key to the communication. And here's a question. Do you think that makes men and women better at different jobs? Well, I like that one.
That's a good one. You know what? Usually you'll see that throughout the years, what traditionally was called male styles of management, which tended to be, they were called this like back in the 80s and maybe in the 90s. They tended to be, they used to call like the more directive styles, male styles, and they called the female styles the more collaborative styles. But nowadays we don't use that terminology, and ultimately if it's, what we find is that situational is better. So as far as jobs per se, I don't know that it's really, it really is that we're better at one thing or the other, but being aware of what some of your strengths are. We, you know, as women, you can learn some traits from men, and kind of like maybe cutting through the chase a little more, and men might be able to learn from women that it's important to establish interpersonal relationships. So you kind of need both elements, both of our cultural elements, to kind of be a whole. So I don't know if that answers the question, you know. And as far as ritual apologies, yes, it's something that we learned from a little girl, because again, even when we're little, we don't want to come across as being a witch with a bee, right? That's the worst thing you can be, you know. You want to be liked, and that's part of what is expected of us.
We do have a question.
Yes.
On the comment about the crossing over to a man's perspective being called a bad word in a woman's perspective. The question is, from your own perspective, do you see that in your experiences?
Yes, I would say that I have some very alpha female friends. I have one in particular that I'm thinking about, and it's funny because she says, you know, Maria, I know that when I become a little too, when I go to my male energy, and by the way, I'm going to touch upon this in a couple of slides, but when I go to my male energy, I know that I can really turn people off, you know, both male and female, right? But and I tried to kind of try to keep that balance, like lean into my femininity, and then, but you know, usually, you know, since, and they say, by the way, that when you move up in the echelons of hierarchy, that women do tend to take on more male attributes the further up the ladder they go. But there's something to be said about kind of trying to keeping a balance, like not being seen as too weak, you know, on one hand, or not being seen as too hostile on the other. And it's a very difficult tightrope to walk because, again, you risk either being seen as somebody who's, you know, just a witch, or you get seen as somebody who's, you know, invisible and not very competent. So yes, and you know what, and the older I get, I guess you become a little bit more comfortable because ultimately your age kind of trumps a few of these things, and you kind of become a little bit more confident in your authority. But it's something that, you know, I must say, like in my 30s, I kind of had to battle a little bit more about knowing which way to go. So I don't know if that answers the question.
And we did have one additional comment in reference to that. Said, I was too direct at a class reunion and a male childhood friend called her that particular word, but working in steel has made me more direct, even compared to Air Force pilots.
Oh, wow.
There's a balance, it's difficult, it's a very thin line. And an additional comment, I love and agree with the idea that people have good intentions, and to be aware of the differences and understanding that does go a long way at work and in life relationships.
Absolutely.
And one more, sometimes it seems if you're too collaborative, you lose leadership of the conversation. If you're too dominant, you are challenged more often.
Oh, great observation. And by the way, those of you who are women, you're in a very male-dominated environment. So, to the men, if men are in a more female-dominated environment, it's important to be able to listen a little bit more and kind of like check with other people. If you're a woman in a more male-dominated environment, it's important to maybe know when to rein back on a lot of the rapport talk. So it's important for you to remember who your audience is, and I think that's the truth when you're raising your kids too. You know that you might talk to your son or your older son one way, and your younger son or your younger daughter a different way. You know that you have to kind of adjust your style a little bit. It'll make you a lot more effective. So it's very good, and a lot of this stuff we kind of learn empirically. You don't really need me to tell you this. You probably already lived through a lot of these things. It's just important to know the whys. It's not that, you know, men have or their DNA makes them this way or that way. It's what we learn. And again, maybe it is a combination of nature and nurture. I mean, testosterone versus estrogen. I don't know. There might be a little bit of that in there, but most of it is stuff that we learn and we share with other people. Okay. Now, that said, a lot of people say, well, how about humor?
Hey, Maria.
Oh, yes.
We did have 2 additional quick questions for your opinion.
Okay. Yes.
In your opinion, at what point do you see or think it may be overthinking and you should just relax, be more confident in your authority, and not make the interaction more than it really is? So
I'm totally on board with that comment. I think that if you're overthinking things that then you're not going to be authentic. And I think that it's also a good idea to kind of like express your intent, you know, and when I do, you know, communication workshops, a lot of people forget that you have to kind of share what's on your mind. People can't read your mind. Were you going to say something else there, Andy?
Yeah, and then one more additional comment. Are men expected to maintain the same balance? I see it more as an expectation on women, and just curious how the male colleagues see this.
I think that it's expected now. You see a lot more people, especially like men, are being coached a lot more, especially at higher levels, and they call it, hey, you know, you have to develop your people skills. When somebody says you need to develop your people skills, it means you have to kind of strike that balance, get a little bit more into the rapport. Instead of directing and telling people what to do and solving their problems, coaching styles in leadership are so important now, and they are, you know, all the rage if you want to think about it. Teaching leaders how to be more coaches, you know, that's an example of how men have to learn how to strike that balance too. Kind of going back to the old idea of directive equals male, collaborative equals female. So we don't use the old language anymore, but it's kind of like the same traits that we're talking about. I don't know if that answers the question. Okay, I should probably keep moving, and hopefully we'll have some more time for questions after the next couple of slides. Okay, so I wanted to briefly humor, because it was very interesting. I was reading how, like, in courtship, a lot of people say, oh, I want a guy who can make me laugh. But ironically, the men, when they talk about humor, they want the women to kind of laugh at their jokes. And I guess if you look at it from a very Darwinian perspective, I guess looking for a potential mate who is funny means that he's clever. Okay, so that might be good in the gene pool. But men don't really look for women so much that have to be hilarious or funny. But it's kind of interesting to see that when we talk about humor, men tend to use a little more disparaging humor, like, oh, here comes Chuck, the guy who almost ruined the whole system or the whole project, you know, so you might be a little more disparaging, the guys might be, whereas women tend to use a little more self-deprecating humor, so they kind of tend to laugh at themselves. Again, it's a little bit more vulnerable. And it's very endearing. I can tell you that when you have a good friend who uses self-deprecating humor, you love her to pieces, right? And I think that's one of the things that I think back to my friends, you know. So and then how does this impact in a work environment? A Harvard Business Review study did this. They did this experiment, and they saw that if you didn't know the presenter, and if it was a guy and he kind of cracked a joke in the beginning, it was kind of seen as a positive and functional tool, kind of like a way for you to kind of laugh. But if the woman, it was also somebody you didn't know, and she cracked a joke in the beginning, regardless of whether it was self-deprecating or not, it was kind of seen as something that was distracting and disruptive. So it's kind of goes, and the reason I put that is it kind of goes hand in hand with that first point. And by the way, the participants were both men and women. So it's like how humor is portrayed or seen, or how acceptable it is in different contexts. Now, one thing that I found very interesting is that long-term, a study on marriages showed that even though the woman might have looked for a guy who was funny, made them laugh in the beginning, it was more important that the women be kind of funny or could crack a joke with their husbands later on, especially when they were going through any kind of marital crisis, because they showed that if a woman was able to make, you know, like a funny joke or something that might help save face or reduce tensions and maybe even lower her husband's heart rate, that those couples have a better chance of making it at the end because you know, women might be a little more skilled in that relationship style situational humor. That is very important for kind of, you know, bringing in that solidarity or decreasing tension or conflict. So, you know, a genuine laugh is super important. Now, thinking about how to apply this to the leadership, women and their leadership dilemma, and we're touching on what one of the participants asked before. Usually the notion of feminine authority, we usually relate that to our mothers, okay? So your mother told you, you know, hey, if you didn't do X, Y, or Z, you'd have a timeout. But it's kind of like a benign, nurturing ideal of feminine authority. Whereas male models tend to be more based on kind of like the concept of a warrior or an athlete, you know. So if a woman kind of goes into that male characteristic, you might be considered competent, but you might not be liked so much, okay? And you usually need to work a little harder to get that same kind of recognition, especially in certain industry, right? So again, here's the Goldilocks model, trying to find that bit, kind of like that happy medium. And something I recommend, not just to women, but also to men, it's kind of important to state what your intent is. You know, hey, you know, I really want this project to work, and that's why I'd like to make sure that everybody kind of gets a chance to give a little input before I make a decision. So if you tell people the whys, if you start out with the why, it'll be easier for people to follow your train of thought, follow your logic, and it'll make it, instead of just having people guessing at why you're doing what you're doing, right? And of course, when we think about tips, both for men and women, okay, since we women tend to usually validate first, it's kind of important to make sure that if there's somebody in our team, we got to make sure that we confirm that the person is on the same page as us, instead of like making assumptions. And it's kind of important for the guys, who tend to be a little bit more diving in and maybe a little bit more unilateral in their decision making, to listen to the questions and not see it as like indecisiveness or insecurity, okay? To understand that usually if a woman's asking you these questions, to make sure that the context is complete. And we're going to talk more about context and communication on Thursday. It's a pretty important thing, okay? Now, when we talk about storytellings or making metaphors, like I said, be aware, you might, as a woman, you might not want to go in too terribly deep into your darkest secrets and stuff like that, because it might just go over the guy's head anyway. So whatever storytelling you use, make sure that it's concise and or the metaphors that you use, your analogies, they're kind of relevant to the other person's experience, and it'll kind of like hit home a little bit better, okay? Both ways, and the guys too, make sure that your metaphors, as a matter of fact, I would say, hey, try a personal story or anecdote once in a while, and vice versa, okay? So think about that. The other thing is, try to borrow collaborative and take charge styles from each other. So if there's something there, you can say, you know what, this isn't really that important that everybody be on board and I get buy-in. So maybe I'm just gonna take charge and make make the recommendation without getting other people involved, or vice versa. You know what? Let me just touch base with the other couple of people in my team. To make sure that I have their buy-in as well, right? As far as information goes, I would recommend to the men, try to explain context a little more, and for the women, maybe try to get to the bottom line a little faster, right? And then lastly, if you're stuck in an impasse, kind of go back, go inwards, and check and see if maybe you're not importing some kind of version of your own personal sexual dynamics, like you're not seeing your dad or your uncle or your brother. You're not seeing those characteristics that are kind of annoying you, or that you're assuming certain things. So it's kind of important to kind of take a break and reflect. Okay. So I'm opening it up now to questions and comments, because we've got about 5 more minutes left. So I want to see if there's something that was left out, Andy, that I didn't answer, or something that has come up. Let's touch upon it now.
We did have 2 additional comments pop up from 2 people. I would agree, and not just in terms of how to balance the learned male and female behavior, but also how to balance the different cultures that we have in the workplace.
Okay, that be there on Thursday. We'll talk.
Yeah. And then the other one was, it's natural that everyone likes to be liked, but I would argue that for both men and women, respected is more valuable.
Both men and women? What was that again? I'm sorry, I missed that last piece.
Respected is more valuable.
Okay. Yes, it all depends on what you consider respect. Because respect, by the way, this is very interesting. Respect is a universal value, but how it looks might be totally different from one person to another. So it's a very good point. And it just shows you again how subjective we are in our perceptions.
And I do have a question. What is your opinion of the general gender roles moving forward? Because you had made a comment early on about girls are not playing with their Barbies as long as they used to, and there are more women and mothers in the workforce.
Yes.
So how do you, in your own opinion, see genders moving forward, the roles?
Well, I think that I was reading not too long ago that I think, I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2019, women actually overcame men in the workplace. So, and more little girls are seeing, it's not like maybe 30 years ago where we had more stay-at-home moms. So I think that as far as like expectations are, I think that you're starting to see that, if you do play with Barbies when you're 6 or 7, you've got all kinds of different types of, you got the Dr. Barbie and you've got the, the Safari Barbie and this and that. So I think that the gender roles have definitely been changing in the last, couple of generations. So I think that that's something that's making progress. We're seeing the dads are a lot more hands-on in, raising children as opposed to maybe 20, 30 years ago, where the moms might be the biggest breadwinner. So I think that you'll see that even with Gen Zers are a lot more comfortable with crossing those traditional gender roles that used to be entrenched, a couple of decades ago. Something else there, Andy?
No, I think we have tied it up.
Ooh, okay, good job. We did it. We did it right within the time frame that we said. Okay, well, it's just an idea. I would say just remember to be empathetic, that you've been raised a little differently than your colleague, and you've learned stuff that was reinforced in your household and your environment, whereas your colleague might have had a different, but I think that if you talk, you can understand each other. And if you tell people, hey, you know what, I'm kind of getting this kind of a vibe from you. I know maybe I might be wrong, but help me out here. If you're kind and honest, I think that it's a lot easier to avoid conflict. So with that, I hope that I see you guys on, well, I won't see you, but I hope that you're there on Thursday, and we can talk a little bit more now about ethnic and national cultures and how they impact also in our work environment.
Thank you so much, Maria. We truly enjoyed this session and your time talking about this topic. A lot of valuable information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.